My name is Angie, and this is the story I wasn't supposed to find.
And I'm her sister, Cindy. We started with one name, Stella Smith, our great-grandmother, who gave up 2 daughters, disappeared from history, and left behind almost nothing until a DNA test changed everything. Turns out, Stella Smith wasn't even her real name.
Her name was Estrella Suarez. She came to America from Spain as a child. She married twice, left 2 families, and somehow managed to vanish not once, but twice from history.
In season 1, we found family we didn't know existed. Season 2 is where things get more complicated. New relatives surface, new documents turn up, and some of the answers we finally found led to questions we'd never thought to ask.
This is Buried Threads, a podcast about family secrets and what happens when the past refuses to stay buried.
We're taking a look back at where we were just 1 year ago when we recorded our first episodes. A lot has happened since then, and we've learned so much about our family. Listen to this remix of Season 1, Episode 2, Estrella, to hear just how far we've come. In this episode, we're picking up where we left off with a mystery that unraveled through a letter, a DNA match, and a name no one had spoken in decades.
When we started looking for our great-grandmother, the name we had was Stella Smith, and we thought we were chasing a dead end. We knew she had abandoned her children, our grandmother included, but after 1932, she seemed to vanish into thin air.
We should take a minute to recap what we discussed in our last episode, just to make sure everyone is caught up. Angie, you took up our grandmother's search for her birth mother after she passed away in the early 2000s. She had uncovered her mother's name, Stella Smith, her father, Christopher DeBoard, their marriage in Springfield, Illinois in 1925, and that they had 2 daughters, Florence and Marie Christine. Stella and Christopher got divorced, and Marie Christine was put up for adoption through the Illinois Children's Home and Aid Society. We didn't know what happened to Florence, but thought she may have gone with Christopher.
After many years of searching, some good finds and some false starts, everything changed when our mom took a DNA test. Paul, a close DNA match, connected with me. He was looking for his grandmother, and what he found instead was our family.
Now, Paul had always been told that his grandmother, Estrella, disappeared in the night. She left her husband and baby girl, Mary Rose, his mother, and no one ever heard from her again. Sound familiar?
Too familiar, because our great-grandmother, Stella, also vanished, leaving 2 young daughters behind, including our grandmother, Marie Christine.
Comparing notes, timelines, and DNA results with Paul, we learned that Estrella Suarez and Stella Smith are the same person. Give us some background information on Stella or Estrella. We'll mostly refer to her as Estrella at this point, by the way, and how we connected the dots. Just a little bit of background.
Estrella was going by Stella Smith, and she married Christopher Columbus DeBoard in Springfield in 1925. We have their marriage license application, and we have a newspaper clipping that simply announced their marriage. No other family noted. They both had an address in Springfield. We couldn't find any other information on Stella Smith before that document. Mm-hmm. We also found her, Christopher, and Florence on the 1930 census, but not together.
In the same place, but not living at the same place.
Christopher and Florence are listed at a home together. Estrella, Stella, is listed on that census at the estate of a widow she worked for, Etta Montgomery. However, in the 1930 directory, Stella was listed at the same home as Christopher. Marie Christine would have been in foster care, maybe with her adopted family by then.
So when our grandmother, Marie Christine, began looking for her birth family, she hired a private investigator. She would have begun her search sometime in the 1950s. The Illinois Children's Home and Aid Society facilitated the adoption, and we have very little information from them. When they were contacted, they said their records were destroyed in a fire, which is pretty common. But we do have a narrative that Estrella, going by Stella DeBoard, a.k.a. Stella Smith, see, it's confusing. We have a narrative that she gave to the agency. She described a difficult childhood where, from her perspective, she felt she was treated more like a worker or a laborer for the household than a family member. What reason did Estrella give for putting the girls up for adoption, or at least Marie Christine, because we weren't sure at the time about Florence?
There wasn't really a stated reason given, but the summary gave the impression that she just wasn't financially able to care for them because Christopher was not consistently in the home and he was not providing for the family.
Did she have anything else to say about Christopher other than he just wasn't there and couldn't provide?
Actually, there's a very clear quote written in the summary that said there was nothing known against his character except that he wasn't stable or providing for the family.
Okay.
And that becomes very significant later in the story.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, we grew up hearing that, and I think this was just a guess that came from what little information was had at the time. But we kind of grew up hearing that Estrella or Stella and Christopher had divorced and each took one daughter. Florence went with Christopher, Marie Christine with Estrella. And it seems like the 1930s census maybe supported that story because Florence is listed at a home with Christopher. And we know Estrella had at that time given Marie Christine over to the adoption agency or the Illinois Children's Home and Aid Society. That happened in 1928 sometime. And then Marie Christine would have been adopted in 1932.
We'll get into this when we talk more about Florence in a later episode, but the short answer is we know that this likely is not true.
Okay.
Florence was raised by someone other than Christopher, although it appears they did have some sort of contact that continued throughout her life. We have some documentation that shows that. I know that Christopher shows up on that census in 1930 at the same home as Florence, but that's actually the home of the people who raised her, the foster parents. And I personally don't think that he actually lived there. Based on what we learned about him and what Estrella shared with the adoption agency and was confirmed by his family, I don't think he stayed put anywhere. I think he lived a pretty transient life. At most, he was probably in and out of Florence's life.
Okay. And we had the information from the agency sharing Estrella's or Stella's story and the very limited information from the 1930 census and the Springfield, Illinois City Directory. And we found Estrella again in the city directory listed as working for Etta Montgomery in 1932, but then we got stuck for a while.
Well, it wasn't for lack of looking.
Yeah.
We just couldn't make sense of who this woman named Stella Smith was and where she came from.
And to be fair, Stella Smith was a pretty common, let's say even generic name for the time.
Exactly. You would not believe how many Stella Smith there are.
I bet.
There was no birth record. There was no earlier history. Didn't know where she was born. Didn't know where she had lived. Didn't know a birth date. Didn't know parents' names, and so it became very difficult to try to track down who exactly she was. Just a woman who appeared, married, had 2 children, and then disappeared again.
And someone might say, well, it was the early 1900s. Maybe there just aren't records. And that's true to a point. But there are surprisingly a lot of records from that time period. I mean, we found out like pretty much everything was put in a newspaper.
Everything. There's a lot when you also include church documents, which are considered historical and newspaper postings. Because like you said, everything was posted in the newspaper. It just didn't make sense to not find any trace of Stella Smith before she got married and not much on Stella DeBoard after she and Christopher split.
And by the way, they did not get divorced in the time period that we've been discussing, which is important.
Yes, that comes much later, but it appears they did part ways around the time that Marie Christine was put up for adoption, though their divorce was much, much later.
So our search stalled until Mom took a DNA test in 2021. You connected with Paul, who is a close DNA match from Central Illinois.
Yes, truly Paul's story isn't much different than ours. All he really knew was that his grandmother, Estrella Suarez, had vanished in 1924 from Taylor Springs, Illinois. And that was not too long before Stella Smith mysteriously appeared in Springfield, Illinois.
And if you aren't familiar with Central Illinois, Taylor Springs is about 50 miles away from Springfield, I would say south of Springfield.
Not very far away at all, even in that time period. Estrella's name was not in our family tree, but I had a hunch. When I looked closer at the shared matches, it became clear we were connected through her.
And this wasn't just a guess, because after comparing timelines and relationships and locations, the overlap was just undeniable with the DNA connection.
DNA does not lie.
Yeah. So Estrella Suarez and Stella Smith and Stella DeBoard, they're all the same person. And this really did put new fire into our search. So talking for a minute a little bit more about Paul's story, just remind us what he or his family knew about Estrella and what happened when she vanished, just quickly.
I still chuckle about Paul's first reaction to the connection we were making between his missing family member and our missing family member. And he just said, "You're blowing my mind," which is how I was feeling too. Both of our families had these mysteries, these question marks in our family history. And it was just crazy to think that we could put some of the pieces of the puzzle of each of our stories back together and they fit.
Yeah. Yeah. It's mystery you think it's never going to be solved. And then all of a sudden, part of it is, right?
I can't tell you how many scenarios I ran thinking that I found Stella and then would find something that disproved it and I knew it wasn't. And so this was a linchpin. This was a solid piece that we could bank on. This is who she was.
Yeah. I know our family created a narrative of sorts based on the very little information we had about Estrella and Christopher. Did Paul's family have a narrative about Estrella?
Well, of course, we always try to fill in the blanks. So here's what Paul thought was true from his family. Remember that Paul's mother is Estrella's first daughter, Mary Rose. So Estrella Suarez married Emilio Valdez in 1922 when she was about 15 years old. They lived in Taylor Springs, Illinois. She had Mary Rose in 1923. In 1924, she left Emilio and her baby, Mary Rose, basically in the middle of the night. And they never knew what happened, where she had gone, if anything had happened to her. They didn't know anything about it.
It's really interesting because I was thinking about Estrella leaving and changing her name, and I love to look at the historical context. So I'm thinking about the mid-1920s and what would leaving like that look like for a young woman? She's young.
I don't think she did it alone.
Well, that's the thing, because when I think about the process that we would need to go through, what documentation we would need for travel and getting a job and getting a place to live or whatever, it's pretty complicated. But when you think about a young woman traveling on her own in the 1920s, I mean, she didn't travel a far distance, even for that time period. So probably wanting to stay under the radar. She just left her husband and baby, and I imagine pretty tight-knit community. Then how could she just change her name and reinvent herself? And I wanted to know what that would have been like. So I just did a little bit of research, and there are some challenges. Can I just share these, just historical context? Sure. So first of all, it wouldn't have been normal for a young woman of her age. She would have been in her teens.
Yeah.
To travel on their own would be very unusual. She would typically be with a group or have a male escort. So maybe some danger involved in that kind of travel. I know we talk about her disappearing in the night. We actually don't know when she disappeared, but that idea of sneaking off in the middle of the night, that would be dangerous for a woman her age. Okay, that would have been
like 17.
That would have been dangerous today, but in that time especially, she would stand out as a young woman traveling alone, especially in that relatively conservative area. Also, I was thinking about finances. Most banks in that time, women did not have their own bank accounts. They couldn't. They had to have a male signer. It would be a father if you're not married. And if you're married, it had to be your husband. So she would not necessarily have access to her own funds. Or if she did, it would be funds that she shared with Emilio. So there's just a question mark. Financially, would she be able to pick up and leave on her own? It's just a question mark, but she would need to access that. And then you think about things like work. There was work for women. They would have been limited. It would have been domestic help or some factory work or maybe teaching or something like that. But that would have been a challenge. How would she have supported herself?
And this is leading into the Great Depression.
And this is leading into the Great Depression. Yeah, this is the early 20s for sure. And you just think about social norms, traveling alone, staying somewhere with someone that she didn't know. If she didn't leave by herself, she would have had to have rented a room. But that's, first of all, it costs money. So did she have finances? Second of all, you couldn't just rent a room. If you wanted to stay at a boarding house, you usually had to have a personal reference. So she almost unfathomable that she did this completely by herself. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it seems highly unlikely that she did this by herself, that she just left by herself. I also looked at the legal changing of one's name because
she didn't do it legally.
Yeah, she couldn't have. One of the really interesting, there is a whole process. I don't feel the need to go through the whole process, but one of the interesting things that's part of the legal process is if you were going to change your name in that time, they would actually post it in the newspaper for 3 weeks before the change would take place. So they would say, this person is changing their name from this to this. And it would just be in the newspaper, I imagine, so that if there was any issues, the public could be aware and could speak up about that. So she didn't do it legally. There's no way she did it legally. Plus time and money and all those things that would have been involved. So it's just a really interesting thing. So those are challenges. But at the same time, being the 1920s, there were also some things that might have been advantages compared to today. In the 20s, photo IDs and driver's license, all of that weren't standard. So it wouldn't be unusual for someone to say, I don't have any ID. I mean, today I can barely buy groceries without having an ID, but it just wasn't like that at that time. Someone could use a school record, a church record, like baptism or something like that, baptismal record or something, or they could even use personal letters as informal identification. Okay, so we use mail, but it has to be certain kinds of mail. This could just be a personal letter that somebody else sent. You have it in your possession. You say, this is who I am. And they're like, oh, okay, this I mean, I'm not saying it always worked that way, but it's possible. Same thing with travel, employment, a place to stay. All of those things could be obtained through a personal reference.
Which leads back to someone probably had to provide some help.
Right, exactly. That's what we keep leading back to. So possible, yes, but it would have been with somebody else doing it with her. And then the other thing we do have to take into consideration is that she was an immigrant. And immigrants, we know it's extremely common that names were changed or simplified when they came to the U.S., either for ease or clerical errors or whatever reason, especially children going into school in America. They would change their names just to make it easier. And so there were a lot of Spanish immigrants in central Illinois at that time, just because of what was going on in the world. And then the industries that were available, the mining industries and everything. So a Spanish woman with the last name Smith really wouldn't have raised a red flag for anyone. It wouldn't have been unusual.
While official processes like name change and things like that would have been difficult for her, it's also possible that she traveled to Springfield, gave a different name, Stella Smith, instead of Estrella Suarez or Estrella Valdez, her married name, found employment, a place to stay without any official documentation. She literally could have just shown up and said, this is who I am.
Right. It does leave me wondering a few things, which we've already mentioned. Did she travel to Springfield alone in the middle of the night, or did she leave with someone else? Did she take off with a friend or someone else? A woman traveling with another person would be safer. It'd be less conspicuous. Somebody else might have financial means or a place to stay, or may have been able to help her establish a new name. And then the second question would be, if not that, then did she go to family or close friends living in Springfield? It's not that far away. It's possible that she had family and friends or somebody there, and they could have helped her establish all those things. And she would have stayed off the radar maybe if she was living with family or friends until she married Christopher, which is the first official record that we have of Stella Smith, who then became Stella DeBoard.
So she was Stella Suarez, and then Stella Valdez, and then Stella Smith, and then Stella DeBoard.
Yeah, that's why we just keep referring to her as Estrella mostly, because that's the earliest name we have for her, Estrella Suarez. But it's a lot. Yeah. So the last thing is, a lot could be accomplished by personal reference, but without the official legal processes, what about marriage? Didn't there have to be legal documentation for marriage? And I looked this up too. A marriage license was required. So for her and Christopher, I'm going to say they were legally married, but really they weren't legally married because she legally married Emilio and never legally divorced him. So technically, but for all intents and purposes, she went through the legal process to marry
we have
Christopher.
a copy of that documentation.
And we have a copy of that documentation. So it was required at that time. But when I was researching this, it said a couple could show up to county clerk office. That would have been Sangamon County in Illinois. And they would need to provide their name, their ages, their residence, sometimes their parents' name if they were minors.
Yeah, it did not list their parents' name in there.
Or maybe they lied about their age.
Yeah.
Which is also possible. I mean, Christopher would have been older, but she was younger. But without standard IDs, they could show a birth certificate or a baptismal record, to verify their age. Birth certificates would have been very challenging for anyone born before 1916 because they weren't standard. And that just varied from state to state. But of course, she's an immigrant. She wasn't born in the state of Illinois. She wasn't born in the U.S. So, because of that, records were so varied from around the world and what was available. People could have just provided a personal reference from another family member or somebody else in the community that would have been acceptable to the county clerk's office. Sometimes, again, even just a personal letter would suffice. I mean, it's possible, right? She didn't have to have a lot of legal documentation to present herself as Stella Smith to legally marry Christopher DeBoard. There would have to be witnesses for the wedding. Do you remember if there are witnesses?
It's not on the marriage license. The marriage license just has Christopher and Stella.
And it could just be people from the county clerk's office. Yeah. So after thinking about Estrella's reinvention from this perspective, I have more questions than answers, which is kind of becoming a theme.
Yeah. Very good questions that we don't have the answers to, not yet anyway. But this is how Estrella's story is shaping up for us at this point. She married young to Emilio Valdez, which was not that unusual for that time period, and she had a daughter named Mary Rose. They lived in Taylor Springs, Illinois. In 1924, she left her husband, daughter, her life, her culture, and seemingly in the middle of the night. And from all evidence, she never returned to those roots. or made any connection with her culture again.
Right.
At some point, she made her way to Springfield, Illinois, about 50 miles away from Taylor Springs. She changed her name to Stella Smith, likely unofficially, because we found no record of that legal
There's
change.
no newspaper posting saying that she changed her name.
She married Christopher Columbus DeBoard in 1925 in Springfield, and then she became Stella DeBoard.
With a new name, new husband, in a new town, Estrella seemingly had a new life. I wonder if she felt hopeful of this new beginning.
Sadly, we know it didn't last long. Within a few short years, they had 2 daughters that were separated, and at least one child, Marie Christine, was given up for adoption. And once again, Estrella vanished, not only from her children, her husband, her future family, but also from history. There is very little to no documentation of her after that.
Wow.
Under a name that we know.
Right. Thinking about Estrella's future family, I feel sad for this woman who wouldn't know her own children, Mary Rose, Florence, Marie Christine, and who wouldn't know her future grandchildren like Paul and our mom, Chris. She wouldn't know her many great-grandchildren, and we wouldn't know her. And it leaves me wanting to know more about Estrella's early life.
Well, that's where we're going to go for our next episode. We're going to explore what we found out about her early life before she got married to Emilio, and how she ended up in Taylor Springs. There's a lot we need to explore from that time period. So we'd love to hear from anyone with advice on how to find out more.
So maybe we'll gain some understanding of what shaped the woman who left 2 families behind. Again, we're not trying to judge choices that she made, but we do want to know her story because she is a part of our story. So tell us a little bit more about what we're going to learn next time.
Well, like I said, we're going to go further back in time to the story of Estrella's family and how she came to the U.S. and her childhood here with a couple named Manuel and Rosa. Theirs is a love story that began with loss, which helped shape Estrella and everything that followed.
A quick word for anyone just joining us at the beginning of this story. Everything we just told you about Estrella, it's not where the trail ends. In season 2, we find her. Not just a name this time, but a husband, 2 more children, and finally the place where she's been resting since 1981. Episode 3 of season 2 changes everything you think you know. And in episode 7, we hear from a voice we never expected. Someone who was actually there when Estrella walked away from Emilio and baby Mary Rose. What she says doesn't match the story this family believed for 100 years. And that's just 2 threads. Season 2 has a lot more waiting to be pulled. Go listen. It only gets stranger from here. And listen for updates in real time as we continue to research. When it comes to this story, we never know what we're going to find. Thanks for listening.
You can find us on Substack at buriedthreads.substack.com, where we release every episode along with documents, photos, and details that don't always make it into the audio.
You can also find and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And if you haven't yet, subscribing or leaving a review makes a real difference in helping other people find us.
Find us on Facebook and Instagram. We're at Buried Threads.
If something we've shared has stirred something in your own family story, we really do want to hear it. You might be surprised where a single thread leads.
Until next time, keep pulling the thread.
And now we finally understand. We are the ones who kept on looking. We are the children of the found. We pulled the thread and felt it pulling back up through the dark, up through the ground. Didn't find the grave or the face, but something in us healed, just knowing she existed. She was real. She had a name.